Why are Russians not protesting the war in Ukraine? It's a question that's on everybody's lips. Many remember the large protests against the war in Germany, Czech Republic, Georgia, and many other countries, but none in Russia. Why is that? Why have there been no major protests against the war in Russia? In order to answer this question, we must first answer a few others. Well, not really. Russians began protesting against the war in Ukraine on February 24th, the first day of the invasion. Protests swept across Russia from Moscow to St. Petersburg to Yekaterinburg to Novosibirsk to cities across the nation. The rallies went on for days, but all of them were broken up by the police. Participants were detained and some were beaten. After that, Russians only dared to speak out against the war on an individual basis, and all of them were also detained by the police. In the city of Nizhny Novgorod, for example, a girl was detained even for displaying a white sheet of paper. Public protest in Russia is against the law, but some are still willing to take the risk. In 2022, almost 20,000 people were detained for anti-war protests, and only 25 days of the entire year went without a protester being arrested. Protesting in Russia is illegal, as is holding an anti-war stance. The Russian parliament passed two laws shortly after the invasion of Ukraine. One prohibits discrediting the Russian army. The other prohibits spreading fake news information about the Russian military. What does this mean exactly? If you go into a public space with a "No to War" placard, you will be accused of discrediting the Russian army. This, for example, happened to a girl who displayed such a poster in St. Petersburg. It also had the words, "My mother said that I cannot be detained for these words because Russia is a free country and Putin is the worthiest president," written on it. You can also be fined and accused of discrediting the army for an anti-war post on social media, even for something that appears in your sleep. A resident of the city of Chita, located in eastern Russia, posted on social media that he'd had a dream about meeting Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. For this, the man was accused of discrediting the army and fined. The second law, which prohibits the distribution of fake news about the army, is even stricter. It can be punished with up to 15 years in prison. What exactly constitutes fake news about the army? According to the Russian authorities, it is anything that has been denied by the Russian Ministry of Defense. For example, opposition politician Ilya Yashin spoke on a live stream about Russian soldiers killing civilians in the town of Bucha. He was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison for this. Similarly, politician Vladimir Karamurza spoke about Russian war crimes and is now in prison awaiting trial. Another example is journalist Maria Ponomarenko from the city of Barnaul. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison for posting on social media about how Russian troops bombed a theater in the city of Mariupol. This bombing killed hundreds of people. The Russian authorities, however, deny this and are subsequently accusing the journalists of propagating fake news. People in Russia are afraid to protest or even speak out against the war. The country is currently in a climate of repression and military censorship. As such, very few people dare to speak publicly about the war. This isn't really the case either. Mass protests first began in Russia in December 2011, when Vladimir Putin announced that he would run for a third presidential term, and there was evidence of large-scale fraud in favor of the presidential party United Russia in the parliamentary elections. One such rally took place on the 6th of May 2012 on the eve of Putin's inauguration and was violently broken up by the police, who charged the participants with rioting and sent 20 of them to prison. Since then, Russia has introduced laws that have made protests more difficult to conduct and increased penalties for participants. Rallies even have to be approved by city authorities. In some cases, the authorities have allowed protests, such as in 2014 against the annexation of Crimea. But in most cases, the authorities have managed to find excuses to deny protesters the permission to hold rallies. When opposition activists staged rallies despite the ban, police beat up and arrested protesters, which happened during demonstrations in 2017, 2019 and 2021. Opposition leaders have also always been under pressure in Russia. One such leader, Boris Nemtsov, was assassinated near the Kremlin in 2015. Another opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, was poisoned with a radioactive substance in 2020. He survived and was treated in Germany, but when he returned to Russia, he was arrested and sent to prison. Navalny's political party was banned and declared an extremist organization. Another politician, Andrei Pivovarov, was accused of collaborating with an undesirable organization. He was sent to prison for 4 years. Well, we don't really have an answer to this question. According to the official data of the Russian Public Opinion Research Center, VTIOM, the public's level of trust in Putin is 79%, and support for the war is at about the same level. But independent researchers note that the official data cannot be trusted. It may be falsified, and people are afraid to answer honestly, just like in Nazi Germany in 1940s. After all, they could be accused of discrediting the army or spreading fake news. The Meduza newspaper published data from a secret poll commissioned by the Kremlin in December, which showed that only 25% of Russians are in favor of continuing the war. Sociologist Grigory Yudin suggests that the largest part of the Russian population can be classified as a passive majority. These are the people who do not support the war, but are also not ready to oppose it. They just try to live their lives as they usually would and not think about the war next door.